There was once a time when there were only occasional federal taxes, no 9-to-5 jobs, and farmers markets as far as the eye could see. And then the Black Death came and ruined the whole thing. Chapter 1: The Country. This was back in the 12th and 13th century in Europe, often called the High Middle Ages. For the average peasant, life was lived locally. Back then, life out in the country revolved around the local knight. Knights had the power to levy and collect whatever taxes they pleased. Nowadays, we tend to think of medieval knights as heroes out of books, but actually, chivalrous characters like Lancelot were written to inspire knights to act better, because in reality, knights were thugs. So these thuggish knights would show up every once in a while, steal your stuff, and call it a tax. But that's not all. The knight would also say, hey, you've got to work my land, maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks every year, and you have to do this for the rest of your life. Also, your kids will have to do it too. Really, it was more like paying protection to a local mafia boss than paying the government for public services. So you have to pay knights, and you have to work for them, but there is one out. Peasants could move to the city. If a peasant got to a city and was able to stay there for exactly 1 year and 1 day, then they were no longer obligated to their knight. They were just a free man living in the city.
Out on the town. Out on the
town. A year and a day, it all starts today. With this life, there's no need to frown.
The thing about working back then is life was just way more laid back than it is now. People didn't have 9-to-5 jobs. They didn't even necessarily work every day. But if you're new to the city, you need some way to make money. Let's say you want to be a shoemaker. The first thing you'd need to do is apprentice for someone else for up to 7 years first, and eventually it would be time to set up your own shop. Before you set up that shop, though, you should really talk to the guild. The guild system, well, there's nothing really like it today. You might be imagining a modern union, but guilds were much more all-encompassing. They were sort of like organizations that existed to keep modern economic ideas at bay. They worked specifically to benefit producers at the expense of consumers. And they did this by aggressively eliminating competition. For instance, by forbidding advertising, or by limiting the number of hours that anyone can work in a day, or by specifically defining the techniques that each craftsman must follow. Let's say someone came up with a faster or cheaper way to make shoes. The guild would freeze them out so they wouldn't undermine people who were doing it the old way. And they'd set the number of shoemakers per town to prevent too much production. So if you're trying to get into the action and they don't feel like there's space for you, they will knock your house down, take your tools, and try to have you thrown out of town. The reason the guild did all of this was because they didn't want too many shoes going on the market. Fewer shoes meant shoemakers could charge more. The thing is, today we know that if they had just flooded the market with shoes, people would have bought more shoes. Instead of a new pair every few years, they might buy a pair for every season. And then they could export their extra shoes to neighbors in the next town. So why didn't the guilds think of this? Well, two reasons. The first is that there just wasn't a very big supply of money in Europe at the time. They were still using precious metals like gold and silver as their currency back then, and a lot of that money was being lost to trade with the Near East. Today, the government could just print more money, but back then, less money meant people bought less stuff, and so producers made less stuff. The other big problem is transportation costs. Roads were just too bumpy and dangerous to make it worth selling your shoes all over the country. And the goods that were shipped long distances were things that had huge value for the weight, like spices. That meant that people couldn't even try to expand their market, and so artificially keeping the supply low worked for the guilds. It's not really until the 14th and 15th centuries that the guild system begins to break down. And it's in large part because of the Black Death. Over just 4 years, 30 to 50% of Europeans were killed by the plague. This massive die-off led to a huge increase in the demand for labor. Suddenly, workers had more power and fewer obligations to their employers and the guilds. They could ask for more money. And similar things were happening back in the country. Remember those thuggish knights? Well, they could no longer force peasants to work for them for free. By the 16th century, feudalism was on its way out. It was the beginning of the monetized labor markets we still have today. In fact, it's kind of how this whole modern economy thing got started. The end.
Support for NPR comes from Okta, a leader in identity-driven security.